Hey, welcome back to the Ready State. Talking today about one of my favorite things, which is spinal flexion, which means can I flex my spine forward as if I needed to bend over and touch something? Now, in strength and conditioning, this gets a little bit confusing because what we're always working on is trying to put the spine into the best position to handle axial loads, loads vertically, loads that translate energy or transmit energy rather from the hip through the spine and upwards, and typically that's a lot more mid-range. And we've talked about this in previous posts. But what we cannot absolutely say is that sometimes you're gonna have to round your back. In fact, if you go back into the archive, we've got about 500 ways that we end up flexing our spines in training. In fact, let me just say straight up, that if you're not flexing your spine as part of your training, then your training is incomplete. So jump into a yoga class, you're gonna see that there's a lot of flexion in the spine. Climb a rope, do a pistol, roll. At some point you're gonna realize, hey, I need to flex the spine. Even kipping is being able to teach someone to go from a globally flexed position to a globally extended position back and forth. So one of the things that shows up though when we're trying to sort of rationalize or tell people flexion is normal, flexion is normative in the spine, is that we see the Jefferson curl. And this is my lovely wife, Juliet, engaging in a flexion loaded activity, a loaded flexion activity. So there's a lot of things going on underneath here. One is that she's mobilizing herself with a little bit of overpressure into this end range position, which tells her brain this is not a threat. And also just, sometimes these tissues end up being stiff and need a little bit of overpressure for us to achieve full end range. She's working on breathing here. We'll talk about a couple other things. But more importantly, what you want to understand is that if you cannot flex your spine, then what we say is that you actually have a dysnormal or a joint motion system that is incomplete. So what we know is that, hey, in order for a healthy spine to be healthy, I should be able to go to end range comfortably, and I should be able to go to end range the other way comfortably. The problem is, what we do is we say, okay, global spinal flexion, let's do it, hold this weight, fold over, and we fail to appreciate sort of the greatest limiting factor in ability for me to flex my spine effectively, and that is the hip. So Juliet here has a good example, because if you drew a straight line out from her hip out, that would be 90 degrees. And what I want you to show you is if we take her hip joint and drive a line in, she's actually sitting well beyond 90 degrees. And so her body is forward, and what's happening is because she has enough hip flexion, her compressed belly is laying on her thigh here, just like a forward fold. There is less total loading that needs to happen in the upper segments of the spine. So one of the things that we're always trying to do when we're trying to unravel sort of flexion-related pain or extension-related pain is look at the big loads and the big drivers underneath, right above and below that system. So we say the spine is, of course, the first engine, right? We work in a wave of contraction from trunk to periphery, from core to sleeve, from axillary skeleton to peripheral skeleton. That's the definition of functional movement. But the big engines are the hips compared to this little engine of the spine. So our primary engine, the big rocket boosters, the hips and the shoulder. And as we're always talking about, if we're going to have a more stable, robust system, I better restore and make more normative the function at the hip and the function at the shoulder. So if I'm missing hip flexion, then what's going to happen is that Juliet's going to come down, get stuck because her hip can't come to her chest, or chest can't come to hip, and she's going to have to use her spine to create a lot more motion. So what ends up happening then is that people are saying they're getting tons of massive amounts of motion in the spine during this forward flexion, and that's because you're not seeing this global, nicely, evenly distributed load. And you start to see huge sections where we're getting a lot of motion happening in a single section, which just is less effective sort of arch theory. I mean, out of a global position into a local hinged position. Now, the key here, and the short takeaway is, if you want to improve your Jefferson curl and your flexion, make sure that you've restored your hip flexion first. This is the crucial idea, that if we start to view the hip as just another motion segment, not special, but part of and not distinct from the total spine, then we start to view the first aspect, or the base of the spine, is really the relationship between the femur and the pelvis. And if we start to take that out, then we know we're going to improve function of the whole system because it gives us more options. I guarantee you that before, if Juliet was super stiff and just stuck at 90 and she hinged over, she's not going to be able to breathe. In this position, she maintains a lot of her function, a lot of her integrity, her ability to ventilate, her ability to pressurize, and ultimately we're trying to make decisions that lead to better and increased function, not down-regulation of function to solve a movement problem. So look, if you have incomplete hip function, are you going to be able to Jefferson curl safely? Absolutely. We need you to be able to do that. Pull that belly button to that spine, flex your quads, go to yoga class, you're going to do it 100 times. But if you want to improve that, work on that hip flexion, which is that pistol archetype or squat archetype. The more function you have in the hip, the better function you'll have in the spine.